Hello, my name is Reverend Dr. May Elise Cannon. Today is the 200th day since the attacks by Hamas on the south of Israel on October 7th. 200 days. In the last 24 hours, the Israeli Defense Forces called on residents in North Gaza and Beit Lehiya to evacuate. You'll recall in North Gaza, that's where there's only a few 100,000 Palestinians remaining. This is where the majority of the population, the 1.7, the 1.8 million people already have evacuated from. North Gaza is where the U.S. Administrator Samantha Power has already said famine has begun. And so this call for evacuation, it's unclear what that's all about. The United Nations also came public or went public with an independent review stating that they have found that Israel has not provided evidence for its claims that many employees of UNRWA, the United Nations Refugees Worker Association, are members of Gaza's terrorist organizations. You'll recall that right after the International Court of Justice deemed that a potential genocide could be happening in Gaza, Israel came forward with accusations about UNRWA. The US said that they were going to stop funding UNRWA, even though there was no payment due. Other nations followed suit. And so the UN did an independent review, and they're claiming that there has been no evidence brought forward. The review into the agency's neutrality was led by French Foreign Minister Catherine Colonna. It's separate from another UN probe into the veracity of Israel's claims that 12 UNRWA employees were involved in the October 7th attacks. The UN rights chief Volker Turk said he was horrified by the destruction of Nasser and Al-Shifa hospitals in Gaza. We've talked about that numerous times over the last 200 days. And I gave the update yesterday that there was a mass burial found with 200 plus bodies in this mass grave. There are signs of possible executions. The IDF denied allegations of mass graves and executions, saying that it had exhumed corpses trying to find bodies of Israeli hostages. Satellite photos in the Associated Press appeared to show a new compound of tents near Khan Yunis in South Gaza. The IDF said it is not involved in its construction. The fear is, if there is a tent city being constructed, the fear is that there is a goal to remove populations from Rafah that could allow for Israel to have that full-on ground invasion that they've been talking about for weeks and weeks into Rafah. The death toll in Gaza is now 34,183 Palestinians killed, and those wounded is 77,143, at least according to the health ministry in Gaza. In terms of hostage and ceasefire negotiations, no real news. Qatar has said that they're disappointed with Israeli ministers in terms of their attack of mediation efforts and negotiations. They're examining the seriousness of all the parties involved. Hamas originally said they were going to try to find different mediators than Qatar. They're now saying that they will only work with Qatar, and that Qatar is coordinating with Turkey in order to increase pressure to stop the war. Hamas informed those involved in truce negotiations it will not agree to a mediator other than Qatar, according to Hezbollah-affiliated Al-Ma'adin news. Turkish President Erdogan told reporters that he does not believe that Hamas will leave Qatar, and there are Hamas officials that are in Doha, for example. The UK Foreign Minister Cameron called on Hamas to send the hostages home. They have been away from home for 200 days. In terms of Israel and Iran, it has broken in the news that there were plans for a much more severe attack by Israel on Iran, and that those plans were nixed because of external pressure. According to the New York Times, foreign allies pressured Israel. The original strike had 7 military targets, including near Tehran, and that this attack was thwarted because of international pressure. The sanctions announced by the EU following Iran's attack are regrettable because the country was acting in self-defense, according to Iran's Foreign Minister Hossein Amirabdollahian. So that was reported today. Iran's President Raisi said that an Israeli attack on Iranian territory would bring about a complete change of circumstances and could result in, quote, the end of the Zionist regime. That's according to an Iranian news agency. Secretary Blinken said that the Hamas attacks of October 7th and the loss of civilian life in Gaza, quote, as Israel exercises its right to ensure that the attacks never happen again, also have, quote, raised deeply troubling concerns, end quote. Blinken said Washington is looking into human rights violations in Gaza and added that, quote, what is important in Israel's case is that Israel has demonstrated its capacity to look at itself. This is what separates democracies from other countries, end quote. This is kind of interesting. We've gotten whispers the last several weeks that there is going to be news coming out of the State Department about the application of the Leahy Laws. I don't know if we've talked about that. There's long been criticism that the Leahy Laws apply everywhere, kind of, but to Israel. The Leahy Laws are laws that mandate that U.S. weapons be used according to human rights, to U.S. international law. But they allow for certain units. They're applied to certain units, but Israel's kind of always been the exception, or mostly has been the exception. And so there have been whispers, and it's broken in the news that the Leahy Laws could be applied, and there'll be news coming out of the State Department. And so I wonder if those comments from Blinken are signs that the Leahy Law might be applied in some way, shape, or form to Israel, stating if the U.S. might acknowledge that some human rights have been violated by certain units of the Israeli Defense Forces. I don't know, that's complete conjecture. In terms of Israel, their head of military intelligence, Major General Haliva, he resigned today or Monday, earlier this week. He was the first defense chief to quit in the wake of the Hamas attacks. He announced that the intelligence division did not live up to its task. We've talked about how many in Israel feel like the government failed them and the military failed them. And he said, throughout my duties, I knew that alongside of authority comes heavy responsibility. So this is him, as a military, head of military, taking responsibility. There was rocket fire from Gaza toward the southern Israeli city of Sderot. According to the municipality, 4 other rockets were intercepted. There's no reported injuries. Hundreds are still calling for the release of Israeli hostages from Hamas, including relatives of 12 hostages. They demonstrated in Caesarea on the eve of Passover with the protest seder in front of Prime Minister Netanyahu's residence. And also a Hamas spokesperson was calling for increased unrest, not only in the West Bank, but also in Jordan. In Lebanon, there were some deaths overnight of Hezbollah members. 2 senior Hezbollah members were killed, according to the IDF. And heading into today, escalations continue at the north border between Israel and Lebanon. I wanted to close by sharing from Amanda Weiss' piece that was published today by a Columbia professor. I talked a little bit about what's happening on university campuses yesterday. A Columbia professor, James Seamus, he's a Jewish American screenwriter, producer, business executive, film historian. He sounds amazing. I mean, he's worked on films you would know. He's a professor, he's a director. It's well worth the read, this article. He admonished the media for conflating, legitimate anti-Semitism, which he says must be condemned. And he warns against the conflation with the legitimate criticism of the state of Israel. And he begins and he talks about the disinformation campaign. He said we still shouldn't dismiss credible amounts of genuinely anti-Semitic incidents on the rise here and elsewhere. They deserve condemnation, as does the manufactured hysteria around them, weaponized in the movement to quell legitimate political speech on campus and elsewhere, mainly through the conflation of criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism itself. He then goes on and talks about this rabbi, Rav Eli Bushler, who's described in much of the massive press coverage of terrors. There's all of this fear on college campuses of Jewish students. And at Columbia, this Rabbi Bushler is described as the Columbia Rabbi. And this article says that this Rabbi, Bushler, sent an email to a few hundred students telling them to go home as soon as possible and that they should fear for their lives and their safety. And so this Jewish author, this professor Seamus says essentially that this was complete hysteria. And he says, first of all, Bushler is not the rabbi of Columbia. And he says not only that, he is on staff of the Orthodox Union Jewish Institute for Learning on the campus, which is a wing of the Orthodox Union. And then he says to get a sense of the political mission and its founding director, Menachem Schrader, and he goes on to talk about the biography, that the biography of the founder is that he was a part of a congregation of Efrat, Carmel and Efrat, if you're not familiar, are illegal settlements located in the occupied West Bank. They're centers of a movement called Amana, which is a radical settlement arm of the violent, racist Gush Emunim. Amana was founded and led for decades by Ze'ev Hever, a Jewish supremacist terrorist who spent 11 months in jail for a Jewish underground bombing plot before becoming a major establishment figure in the settlement movement. And so he's talking about we've got to stand up against anti-Semitism, but we all, and Jewish students on campus should not be in fear. And that is something that we absolutely have to stand up against. But also he's talking about how there's a strategy, and in this case, this Rabbi Bushler, there's a strategy of conflating anti-Semitism and criticism of the state of Israel. And so as I close on this 200th day, I just want us to keep in mind so many who are suffering, hostages still being held in Gaza, the 2.3 million people in Gaza who are living under threat daily of bombardment and attack by the Israeli military. Those who are being punished are not the perpetrators of the attacks of October 7th. And we need to not forget those reality. They're paying the highest price, the children of Gaza. So might we work every day to end the ethnic cleansing of Gaza. May we not give up advocating for peace for the sake of Palestine, for the sake of the freedom and liberation of Palestine, for the sake of every person in Israel, for the sake of our own nation. Might we not be culpable in allowing a whole people group, be perpetuated in a state of hunger? Might we work to end killing and death and destruction? That is my hope and my prayer.